Hi folks, and welcome to another weekly video. For those of you that are new to my channel, my name is Adam Gibbs, and each week I attempt to put out a video related to nature photography, either in the field or behind my computer. My regular visitors may have noticed that I haven't put out any new on-location videos lately. I apologize for that, since I'm in the process of moving into a new house and that it's taken up much of my time, mostly cleanup and painting. But I've also been spending a lot of my time working on my second hardcover book entitled Land and Light that I hope to have finished in the next several weeks. For those of you interested, I will have a pre-sale of the book at some point, and the best way to stay up to date for that pre-sale or any other news is to sign up for my newsletter, which I send out several times a year. Now then, in this week's video, I'd like to talk about contrast. One of the things that I love to work with both in the field and behind my computer is contrasts in nature. Contrast can come in many forms, including contrasting colors, texture, shape, and yes, of course, light. So with that in mind, I thought it'd be interesting to show you a few subtle ways to add contrasting elements to your images with just a few adjustments in processing. I'll also show you subtle ways to draw viewers' attention to a scene with simple masks in Lightroom. So let's get stuck right into that. Okay, now the first image that's up is one that I took in the Gobi Desert on a trip with Alistair Ben. I guess that was several years ago now. And throughout the trip, we had a number of different types of light. There were a few occasions where it was quite cloudy, so we had flat light, as you can see in this photograph here. Love the layering and the composition, but there just isn't any contrast. And to be honest with you, that's not really a big problem because you can add contrast so easily in Lightroom or Photoshop or any other program. But one of the things that I noticed about this scene is that, it's very subtle, but the top portion of this photograph is quite a bit cooler than the foreground. So I decided to play on that a little bit and keep that contrast and enhance it a bit just to add some more interest to the photograph. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is bring up the contrast. Now there's a number of ways we can do this. We can either just add contrast like that, or what I prefer to do is reduce or add blacks and the white. So I usually play with those two sliders. So in this case, if you look at the histogram at the top here, you can see that there isn't hardly any brights or darks in this image. It's all in the center here. So all I'm going to do is just bring the darks or the blacks all the way down to about there, and then I'm going to bring the whites up. And of course this is to taste. I like my images quite bright and ethereal, so let's just bring it up to about there for now. And you can see my camera at the time was the Nikon D850. My sensor was just absolutely filthy. But I'll clean it up later on. But as you can see, there's this beautiful contrast, this subtle blue in the background. And what I'm going to do here is just grab. Now we can either do this quick and dirty with a linear gradient. But I think what I'm going to do is, actually, why don't we do that? We'll get the linear gradient and we'll just bring this down right over the top here. And all I'm going to do is just cool that section down ever so slightly, like that. And you can see already we've created this beautiful contrast between the foreground and the background. And the nice thing about this is that I've said this a number of times, but cool colors tend to recede into the background and warmer colors come forward. So it adds a little bit of depth to the overall scene. Now, I would probably, let's just get rid of the mask here, add some more contrast in this. Let's bring up the highlights and we'll bring down the blacks even more. as I'm sure most of you know, it's subtlety and it's playing around with the sliders. Of course, the other way we could adjust this is by using the tone curve. And I tend to use the tone curve more in Photoshop, not so much in Lightroom for some reason. I find that the sliders work just fine for me. But if we go to the darkest areas here, we can just bring those down, and then the brightest areas, bring those up. Anyway, you get the idea, and here is a finished version of that photograph. You'll notice this one's a little bit cooler. The shadows aren't quite as contrasty, but I think you'll agree that it really adds a nice dimension to an otherwise very flat and dull image. Here's another example. This was the same area, and again I've done the same thing. I've brought in a filter or a linear filter and just cooled down the background, and then the foreground I've just left the color that it more or less was at the time. Okay, here we have another photograph from the Gobi Desert in China, and as you can see, the light was very flat. This was early in the morning, pretty hazy, not a lot of contrast in the photograph, so we really want to bring that contrast back to add depth. Now this photograph, there are a couple of issues with it, nothing that can't be fixed. The first one is the tire tracks. The tire tracks are actually from our vehicles, since we were the only vehicles in the area. So we're going to have to address those, probably get rid of those with the content aware tool in Photoshop. And also there's a lot of dust spots in this photograph. My sensor was absolutely filthy on the old Nikon, probably from trying to change lenses in blowing sand, which is not a good thing. But we can deal with those afterwards. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to handle this like I have with the other photographs. Bring the blacks down and start to bring the whites up and the highlights. And of course, this is all to taste. You can add as much or as little contrast as you want to your images. That's really up to you. But in this case, this looks absolutely fine to me. The foreground looks great. As far as the format goes, 2:3, not my favorite format, especially for verticals. So I'm going to crop this to 4:5. Something like, let's try that. Now, one thing that you may have noticed straight away is that the background is quite a bit hazier than the foreground, which is great. That creates depth. You'll also notice that the colors are quite different. The background is quite blue, like in the other photographs I've shown you, and the foreground is quite a bit warmer. I'm going to play on that contrast because I really do like that contrast between those colors. And as I said before, warm colors tend to come forward, cool colors recede into the background, so that adds even more depth. So let's grab a filter here, and we'll get linear gradient, just bring that down to about there. And all I'm going to do is just add a little bit more blue. like so. And that's pretty much it. Once I've cleaned up the photograph, I would be quite happy with the results. Another way you could approach this is by flattening out the image. And what I mean by that is adding contrast and whites, blacks to the background to bring the background forward and also warm it up. So let's grab this filter again. Let's get rid of the blue mask. And what we're going to do this time is let's try warming it up. Like so. And I'm going to grab another filter here. This time I'm going to paint this one on. Just grab the brush and we'll leave it feathered. Let's bring the feathering down just a tad. Oops, that's the flow. I'm just going to go up to this dune here. What I'm going to do now is add some contrast, and there's a number of ways we can do that. We can just add contrast with contrast slider, or as I've done in the past, we can add some whites, bring the blacks down, bring the highlights up. And as you can see, as I start to do that, that background starts to now come forward. So it's almost like an optical illusion. And actually, something that works really well with this is you could actually, let's just get rid of that, just use the dehaze. That works really well as well. But you have to be careful with it because it can add contrast really fast. Same with the clarity slider here, does more or less the same thing. Let's go to this filter here again. I'm just going to turn this around a little bit, bring this down, and let's warm that up even more, like that. Now, the brush filter, I haven't done a great job on the edge here, and we can refine that. But this is just a demonstration to show you that you can really control depth by using different contrasts and different colors. And I've noticed this in other people's photographs. Sometimes they use too much contrast in the background, and it loses its depth by doing that. So as I said, if you want to create depth, then you want to do opposite. Less contrast and perhaps change the color ever so slightly. You don't have to do it an awful lot. Just pick and choose the technique that you like best for that photograph. Both of these work fine with this photograph. I think I prefer the contrast between the blue and the warmer tones, but some of you may prefer bringing that background forward. Anyway, it's a neat technique to try, and perhaps something that you'd like to try in your own photographs. Thanks, as always, for watching this week's video. I promise that at some point shortly, I'll be returning to the field again with me doing what I love best, making images. If you'd like to support my channel and work, please head to my website where I offer workshops, books, prints, and quiet light merchandise. So until next week, bye for now.